Hi, I'm Nino Gonzalez, and welcome to another episode of Making Sense. Well, today I am going to cover a variety of topics and hopefully end up with something fun at the end. So I'm not going to stay on one topic, but cover a wide variety of topics, including taxes, documents we should have ready at all times, and also how to get your credit started and then ended up with something fun. So, first of all, let's talk about taxes. The tax season just recently ended, and hopefully you got a refund, and hopefully you still have some of that refund and haven't spent it all and did some wise things with it. But if you didn't get a refund, what if you owed money? And what if you couldn't pay? Well, I hope at least you filed your return, even if you couldn't afford to send in a payment. Because let me go over what happens if you don't file and you owe. If you don't file, the penalty for not filing is going to be 5% per month up to after the due date, up to a limit of 25% of your total tax bill. And that's quite a bit of a penalty for not filing. But if I filed and I didn't pay the amount I owed, the penalty is then only 0.5%, which is way better than that 5% we were talking about. So, for example, if you owe $1,000 to the IRS and you don't pay, the IRS is going to assess you $5 a month until you pay the full amount, or if you are making payments on the amount that you owe. But if you didn't file, the penalty will be $50 a month. So if you consider 0.5% every month, that equals to 6% a year, which is a fairly low interest rate when you're owing the IRS money. So hopefully you don't owe that much, and your tax burden was not that high. So you have to consider some alternatives on what is it that you need to do. So, for example, if you owe a small amount, let's say $500, maybe $800, maybe even $1,000, it might be wise just to take the penalty and pay the IRS a little bit at a time until you get rid of that debt. Because when you're considering the alternatives, what if I charge it? Well, if you put it on your credit card, first of all, they're going to charge you a processing fee for doing that, and the interest rate is going to be way much higher than 6%. You might be paying around 12, 18, maybe 20% interest. Now, if your tax bill is a little bit higher, then you might consider an installment agreement request. And the installment agreement request, that is IRS Form 9465, and there is a fee to set it up, ranging from $31 for direct deposit installment to $225 for a regular installment agreement. And those are only applicable to those taxpayers that owe $50,000 or less. So I'm hoping that none of you owe more than $50,000 on an IRS debt, but if you're in that situation, talk to the IRS and set up an installment agreement request, and you can pay that off on a monthly basis. You can even set how much you want to send in and on what date they can deduct that money out of your checking account. And make sure you stay current on that, because then the penalties and interest will even be higher. So when we're talking about what should I do? Well, it all depends how much you owe in considering those alternatives. Now, the best thing would be to get an interest-free loan, maybe from family member or friends, if you can, if it's a small amount, and make sure you pay them back. But if you can't, well, 0.5% interest every month is not that bad, and make those payments as soon as possible and try and get rid of that debt. So I know we stress out about it. We say, hey, I owe the money. The IRS is going to come after me. What do I do? Don't worry about that. Make the payments. If you can't, call them and get an arrangement set up. But never ignore your tax bill, because the IRS, if you do ignore your tax bill, they can place a federal tax lien. And that's the government's legal claim against any real estate, personal property, and financial assets. So please do not ignore your tax bill. Now, how do I get from not being in this situation in the following year? Well, one of those things is make sure that we revise our Form W-4. And in past shows, I talked about that, and we'll put a slide up reminding you what that form looks like. And that's where you tell the IRS, you tell your employer whether you're single or married and how many allowances you're claiming. And an allowance is basically you and any dependents that you're claiming. So if you're being withheld too little, you might want to drop down an allowance or maybe have an additional amount withheld if you think you're going to be in that situation again next year. Also, another alternative is to make estimated quarterly payments to the IRS on that additional amount you're going to be owing, that you think you might be owing. The best thing that I suggest is have it taken out through your employer. That way you don't worry about it, and hopefully you won't be in that situation again next year. But one thing, please do not ignore those tax bills. I've known a lot of people who do, and what happens is then the IRS comes after them. The IRS, believe it or not, is there to help you. If you call them, set up an agreement, tell them your situation, they will work with you, and sometimes depending on your circumstances, they might even waive some of the penalties and interest. So don't be afraid to talk to them. I know it sometimes you might be on the phone for a few minutes, on hold. Right now, it might not be as bad as during filing season, but make sure you get that taken care of. So that's one of the topics that I wanted to cover, especially since we just passed tax season, and some of us might owe some money. And in a previous year, I did wind up owing a considerable amount of taxes, and I couldn't pay it. And so what I wind up doing is setting up an installment agreement request, and I was paying off, I think it was $250 every month. That's what I could afford, and within a few months, I was out of that debt. So they are willing to work with you, and sometimes it's better than taking out a credit card advance or charging it, because the interest rates are going to be lower with the IRS than it is through a credit card or maybe even taking out a personal loan. So you do have options. So now let's talk about some other things that we must be aware of, and let's talk a little bit about estate planning. In the past, I've had an attorney, and we've talked about probate and estates and wills, but I just like to take a little time to remind us all what is it that we really need. And there's 8 essential documents. Some of us might need all of these. Some of us might need some of these. So don't worry if some of these do not apply to you. But the first thing is definitely a last will and testament. And your will is basically your directives of what is it that you want to go to whoever you designate. But that does not include pass-through property. What do I mean by pass-through property? Those that you've designated as beneficiaries. For example, life insurance policies. If you have a beneficiary or beneficiary's name, that is pass-through property, pass-through cash. Or let's say your retirement plan, when you designate your beneficiary or beneficiaries, that's also a pass-through item. So what we're talking about is those things that we cannot designate beneficiaries. For example, real estate, personal property, and any other things that you consider of value that you want to pass on to whoever you want to designate. And that has to go in our last will and testament. And talking about beneficiaries, sometimes we don't update those. So make sure that all of our beneficiary designations with our life insurance companies, our retirement plans, and any of other type of those things, they're updated, and we keep them updated on a regular basis. But the last will and testament, it has to be while you're in sound mind, and in there you will also include who will take over as being guardians if you have any minor children, including pets nowadays. So it's important that we designate that in our last will and testament. And if you're married, each one of you has to do one. So usually what will happen is that if one spouse passes away, everything will go to the other spouse. But then you also have to have a clause in there, what happened if they both pass away at the same time? Then that's where you start naming what goes to whom. Now, if you don't have a will, then the court is going to have to decide who the executor is going to be of your estate and how the property is going to be split up. And that might not be according to your wishes. Now, also, if you do have a will, it does have to go to probate as well. And make sure that if there's any changes that happen in your life, make sure you update that will. And usually you can update it not by doing an entire will, but adding a supplement. So another thing that you might consider would be a revocable living trust. And a revocable living trust is basically you are passing your assets to the trust, and then the trust will transfer those assets to your heirs. And you name a trustee, perhaps a spouse, a family member, or any trusted individual that you might have. And one of the things of a revocable living trust, it doesn't have to go to probate. So you might save those costs. Now, when would you recommend a trust or a will? Well, it all depends on your situation and how much assets you have. So for some individuals, it might just be best to go with a last will and testament. With other individuals, it might best to go with a revocable living trust. So it all depends on your financial situation. Another thing that we might have, we already talked about beneficiaries, but definitely power of attorneys. Now, there's several power of attorneys that we need to have. For example, that would be a financial power of attorney, a medical power of attorney, and those are going to be used where you name somebody in case you can't handle these situations, who's going to handle your finances and who's going to handle the medical decisions in case you can't do it yourself. So those are important. Now remember that power of attorneys will end when you pass away. So it is important to have those situations taken care of before you pass away, and remember that they end at that point. And depending on the financial institutions, they might require specialized power of attorneys. One of the ways to avoid that is also to have PODs, which means paid on death, on specific savings accounts and checking accounts. And you can add that on where if you pass away, paid on death, that will transfer to whoever you name. Well, we will continue discussing these items more on the second half of Making Sense. Welcome to the second half of Making Sense, and we were talking about essential documents that you need for estate planning. And let me continue with those. And one of the things that you might also consider, and that most medical care institutions offer, is a living will. And this will basically be a directive of what will happen if you become in an incapacitated state and you have to be supported by life support system, and what is it that you want to be happening, including a do not resuscitate order. And those are very important because when it comes to those type of issues, emotions can get really can get very tense at that time and can range, and family members then might get into fights with each other and not know what to do. So it is important that you state that directive in your living will. And usually when you go into the hospital, they give you an opportunity to do that. But sometimes you might not be in the capacity to do that, so it might not be a bad idea to have one of those already done. Another thing would be a provision for digital assets. And this is something new that has come up, but what's going to happen to all those online accounts that you have, including your Facebook account and Twitter account and any other type of accounts that you might have, and make sure you have a listing of what is it that you have along with any passwords and who is it that you want to take control over that, and what if you need to have those shut down, because that will make that individual that is trying to do this life go so much easier in trying to fulfill your wishes. And that's something we don't think about, and sometimes these companies give us a hard time when it's a time of death and we're trying to delete those accounts. Another thing that I would recommend is a letter of intent. A letter of intent is something that would not be included in the will, but what is it that you want to have done, maybe during your memorial services or funeral arrangements? Do you want to be cremated or not? Those are things that you might want to list in that letter of intent that might not necessarily go in the will. Again, during these uh, times of death, emotions range and things can get pretty tense between family members, and it's best that you have that spelled out, and that way you might put your family through a lot less stress. Another thing I would suggest is list your documents. Where are you keeping everything? And is there any passwords that they need to know to any accounts? And make sure you make a list. It might not be best to have those in a safe deposit box, because in most states, when there's a death, they lock those safe deposit boxes and you don't have access to them. So it might be best to put them maybe in a family safe, or maybe in a fireproof box where you might keep special documents, but make sure you leave where the key is or what the combination is, if that is necessary, so your family members can access that. Well, another topic of interest is, what if you don't have credit or you're trying to rebuild your credit? How do I go about doing that? Well, one of the things that I would suggest is to become an authorized user with somebody who has good credit. Now, please do not put that person that you're getting into their account with into jeopardy. So what I would suggest, ask them to put you as an authorized user, but don't let them let you have the card. That's one of the suggestions that I would give to you, and hopefully their good credit will help your credit in return. In addition, another thing that I don't suggest, but sometimes we must have to do, is get a cosigner. Now, remember, when somebody cosigns for you and you fail to pay, that individual will become responsible for the debt that you owe, and their credit will also be affected. So that's one of the things I really don't suggest for people to do, but sometimes we might have to do it, is to get a cosigner. And for those of you that are co-signing, be careful who you co-sign with. Another way to build up your credit or get credit is to apply for a secured card. And what is that? Well, basically, you're putting money away in an account. Let's say I want a $500 credit limit, so I'm going to put $500 in that Visa card so I can use it. And as I start using it and paying it back on time, then my credit will build up. Again, it is secured. It is secured by the money that you have. So be careful of who you get those cards with, because some of them might have high fees. So research that thoroughly and make sure you're getting it with an appropriate institution that won't have high fees and is willing to do that with you. Another way to build up your credit is to diversify your debt. We don't want all our debt to be in credit cards, so we might want to apply for maybe an auto loan, a personal loan, if we can, and that will also help us build up our credit. Now, if you can't get credit and you can't get these loans, what do I do? Well, usually if you have an account, especially with a credit union, go talk to them. They've seen people that have been in these situations, and they have secured cards. They might even have secured loans that they can help you with in order to build up your credit or get your credit maybe turned around. So don't be afraid to talk to your credit institutions. I know that sometimes we might feel embarrassed to talk about those type of things, but make sure that we reach out to them for help. Another way and an easier way to build up your credit or get credit if you don't have any, especially for students that might not have a credit record at all, is to apply maybe for a department store card or a gas card. And those are the easiest type of credit cards to get, but they also have the highest interest rates. Now, what we would like to do is make a few purchases, pay them off, make a few purchases, pay them off, and within maybe 6 months to 1 year, you will start getting offers from the major credit card issuers. But make sure we don't get into debt with those cards and we're able to pay them off. So we'll come back and we'll talk about something totally different that does not apply to any type of financial issues. So stay tuned. Well, I know I was talking about some serious topics, taxes and death, but now I told you it was a variety show and I was doing a variety of topics. I want to end up with talking about homemade cleaners. And you know, a lot of us spend so much money on cleaners, usually about $50 several times a year, when would you rather be spending about $20 maybe once or twice a year by making your own household cleaners that are just as effective? Well, one of the things that we might consider always using is, of course, vinegar. And vinegar is a remarkable cleaner. It's also antifungal, antibacterial, and kills about 91% of germs. So usually what I like to do is, and spray bottles are going to be your favorite friend. So pick up some spray bottles at the dollar store, you know, the little ones or the bigger ones. But this one is labeled vinegar and water, and that's what it is. It's half vinegar and half water. And you can use this to clean windows. You can use it to clean countertops. And yes, you will have a vinegary smell, but it will disappear. And it does a great job. And if you want it to even smell nicer, especially on the areas that you're cleaning, well, we can use some essential oils. Essential oils are, for example, eucalyptus oil, or I like tea tree oil. And I don't have a bottle here of tea tree oil, but we can add a few drops in here, just maybe 1 or 2 drops, and you'll have that scent. And it will last longer, and it'll make your cleaning surfaces smell good. And one thing I would suggest before you wipe it down is let it sit there, maybe for a few minutes, because that will create the disinfectant properties. Now, if you have cutting boards, for example, and you want to get rid of some of that foodborne bacteria that might be on there, well, then I would suggest using a bottle, have a bottle labeled for vinegar, and a bottle labeled for hydrogen peroxide. You don't want to mix them together, okay? Because then that'll also destroy some of the natural bacterial properties of each. So if you want to clean a surface that maybe you really want to disinfect, then spray it with vinegar and then spray it with peroxide. Let it sit there maybe for a few minutes and then come back, rinse it off, and wipe it off. And it's as good as any other cleaner that you might have. Now, baking soda. Also, we all know about the properties of baking soda and how many uses we can have for it. We put it in our fridges to absorb odor. Well, we can use this to deodorize our carpets. So before you take out the vacuum cleaner, sprinkle some baking soda on the carpet, let it sit there. You know, the longer you let it sit there, the better. And then come back and go through a regular vacuuming routine. Now for floors, for example, laminate, tile, a floor cleaner, you want to have half a cup of vinegar to a gallon of water, warm water. And again, if you want to make it smell nicer, then and you want to add a little bit more disinfectant properties, add maybe a few drops of tea tree oil into that mixture, and then mop your floors as regular. And if you want to make maybe a multi-purpose cleaner and maybe with a little bit of grease cutting properties, then I would suggest in a spray bottle to use 8 ounces of vinegar, 8 ounces of rubbing alcohol, 8 ounces of water, and 2 drops of dish soap. Now, why dish soap? Because that's going to have the grease cutting power, and you can use it on your stoves, on your countertops, on maybe your kitchen towel, and it'll cut some of that grease that has been built on. Well, just a little few money saving tips and being a little bit green and friendly, especially since we just had Earth Day a few weeks ago. And let's be kind to Mother Earth and save some money. And hopefully these were a wide variety of helpful topics on this episode of Making Sense. And we'll see you next time.